We've got a lot to break down. Deborah, I want to start with you because you were part of a filing to the justices that argued in favor of keeping affirmative action. What's your reaction tonight?
Yeah, I filed a brief on behalf of the National Black Law Students Association because affirmative action is important, and I think all the voices of people impacted should be heard. I think the court got it all wrong. They misstate and distort how affirmative action works, and they misstate and distort the current reality of racism. Justice Roberts said that eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. But it is, in fact, racial discrimination that makes affirmative action programs necessary. Affirmative action and race-conscious admissions policies really help to address our country's long history of racial discrimination and systemic racial inequality by increasing access to higher education for underrepresented racial and ethnic groups who faced both systemic barriers in our society and also admissions criteria that captured and magnify that racial bias. And the court's decision today is really a devastating blow to those efforts.
Deborah, affirmative action in admissions was already banned in several states, including California and Michigan. And as a result, officials in schools in those states say their student bodies are less diverse today. Do universities now have a responsibility to actively do more?
Absolutely. We saw what happens when states ban race-conscious admissions programs in California and about 7 other states. They banned affirmative action for some time. And we unfortunately saw a significant decrease in Black and Latino enrollment at flagship institutions. We also saw students of color at less diverse college campuses experiencing more discrimination and harassment. And we also know that applications go down because it's sending a message about who's wanted on those college campuses. And so I think colleges and universities throughout this litigation and before have said that they value diversity, that is important to their educational mission. And they're going to have to step up. They're going to have to examine and improve policies and practices to expand opportunity. We'll hear a lot of discussion, I think, about broadening recruitment efforts to underserved communities and developing robust high school pipelines. But they also have to commit to fixing their system. We far too often are focused on fixing the students, but our students aren't broken. Our system's broken. And so I think that means removing all of those factors that really show whether or not you have access to wealth, access to opportunity, access to power. Get rid of the measures that really, at the end of the day, amount to affirmative action for white people.
Michael, the group that brought these cases, right, the people who wanted this outcome, what was their argument?
Their argument was that this was, in effect, reverse discrimination, that this is in violation of the Constitution, and that you need somehow in our society, permeated as it is with race, only to have colorblind remedies. They've been trying to get this result for decades. The facts have not changed. The society has not changed, except becoming more diverse. What has changed is who's on the court. There's now a 6-vote supermajority of very strong conservatives here marching very closely together in lockstep. That's what's changed, and that's why this argument suddenly found receptive ears.
Jeannie, you're at Harvard, one of the schools involved in today's ruling. What is your reaction tonight?
Well, I think that one of the really interesting things about the opinion that I think a lot of people, including Harvard's president, immediately focused on was the Supreme Court's statement that you cannot consider race in admissions, but students can still write about their race in their essays, and that admissions officers can certainly consider the story that students are telling about the role that race has played in their lives and the ways in which certain qualities might shine through in their essays because of the way they engage with that story. And so in some ways, for a lot of people, they might think, well, isn't that what affirmative action was doing anyway, to take into account the role that race might have played in a story of a student who's really trying to explain who they are. And I think the Supreme Court, if you can try to read the court's decision more narrowly to say They just don't want admissions officers to consider somebody's race as race itself. But to the extent that you can tell a whole contextual story about the role of race in someone's life and the way that they are, the individual that they are because of race and their experience of it, that is okay. And so if you focus on that, which I think that many admissions officers and many university officials will do, there's, Justice Sotomayor certainly called it putting lipstick on a pig, but there's a version of this where actually what schools were doing all along was really taking that whole context into account rather than just thinking of race as like a checkbox.
Deborah, I want to go back to something you said a moment ago, that the system is broken. The system is broken with affirmative action. And now without affirmative action, is there an opportunity, an obligation now more than ever to actually fix it?
Absolutely. I think, as I said, our system is broken because we're using criteria for admissions that people want to say are about merit, but really aren't about merit at all. They are about your access to opportunity, your access to resources, to tick all the bells and whistles. But we're in a process that is against the backdrop of a deeply segregated K through 12 school system where Black children, other children of color, really just don't have access to the opportunities that many other children have to take the AP courses, to have all of these extracurricular activities, to take test prep courses. So I think that colleges and universities will have to improve our systems. I think some of that is about considering diversity factors such as socioeconomic status or English language learner status, first generation college students. But they also need to do things like do away with legacy admissions as a factor, get test free and eliminate the barrier that standardized testing creates for underrepresented students, and also implement a really holistic application process. One that evaluates academic achievement in context, maybe gives credit for underserved and underrepresented schools, considers community demographics. There are lots of ways that we can now turn to try to maintain diversity on college campuses and make admissions process more equitable.
Deborah, the money grab hustle of SAT prep, we can do an entire show on that for another night.
Absolutely.
Because it is unfair to another level. Peter, let's touch on what Michael had talked about a moment ago. This court overturned Roe almost exactly a year ago. Affirmative action was clearly high up on the right's agenda. What does that say for the right that they won these two massive decisions, right? Decisions on things that all of us here had probably never thought would be in question in our lifetimes?
These are two huge goals that the legal right has had for many, many years, of course, and many people thought they would never actually get there, that they would be able to trim back perhaps on, for instance, the right to access to abortion, or trim back on the use of affirmative action in higher education, but not to actually sort of overturn them wholesale, as we've seen in the last year. And that's, of course, the result of 3 appointees by President Trump during his 4 years in office. He put on, of course, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, and Neil Gorsuch, all of whom were in the majority today. You take those 3 away, and obviously you look at a different kind of court. And I think you see a lot of energy on the side of the right now when it comes to the court. That doesn't mean they're winning everything. Just the other day, of course, the court ruled against a conservative complaint or conservative side in the voting rights case in Alabama, I think it was, and in fact went ahead with the idea that race is still an important factor in drawing lines and how that can be done. They went against the conservative point of view just yesterday or the day before, I believe, on the issue of whether state legislatures have complete control over elections. That was also a high priority of the right. But no question that Dobbs' decision last year and this decision today are huge wins for the conservative part of the political spectrum that has been trying to build support within the federal judiciary now for years, going back to Reagan through today. And this is, it's a big day for them and a tough day, obviously, for liberals who believe that the entire, settled law in these areas has been upended with the stroke of a pen.
Yes, but of course, that tough day for liberals could excite them at the polls a year from now, which is exactly what we saw happen in the midterms. Michael, I want to share what President Biden and Senator Ed Markey said about expanding the court earlier.
Congress must act. We must pass the Judiciary Act to expand the Supreme Court, reclaim the stolen seats, and begin to restore its legitimacy in the eyes of the American people.
I think if we start the process of trying to expand the court, we're going to politicize it maybe forever in a way that is not healthy.
A lot of Democrats have called for expansion. What is your take on that?
Right now, public support for the court, even before today, has collapsed to the lowest level in polls ever recorded. There's been a lot of energy around the courts on the right for years. You're certainly seeing it now among liberals and progressives and Democrats. Reforms such as term limits, an 18-year term, recognizing that nobody should have too much power for too long, or a binding ethics code for the Supreme Court. These are things that have, I think, the best chance of actually moving public opinion and bringing some accountability to the court. You heard that President Biden is not enthusiastic about court expansion, and I think that some of these other things actually have very wide support among left and right out in the country.
Jeannie, I want you to hear what Senator and presidential candidate Tim Scott said earlier.
One of the things that Harvard can do to make that even better is to eliminate any legacy programs where they have preferential treatment for legacy kids. They're looking for a way to improve the footprint of Harvard. Let's make sure that all admissions are based on academic scores and not just eliminating affirmative action. But let's look at the legacy programs.
Uh-oh, Tim Scott better hope Jared Kushner wasn't watching. We heard a lot about legacy admissions today. What is your take, especially given your Harvard point of view?
Yes, I think that this is the ironic thing about this decision that gets rid of affirmative action, which a lot of liberals are upset about, is that it actually creates opportunities to reimagine college admissions in ways that I think liberals would embrace. And many of those things that Deborah was suggesting earlier, that we need to look deeper at the inequities that admissions really represent. Those things have a better chance of actually happening now because of the reaction to this affirmative action decision from the Supreme Court. So legacy admissions is certainly one of those issues. If it were not for this decision, it's possible that legacies, people would have complained about it, but that there wouldn't have been will to really do something about it. And I do think that now many schools will look carefully at their entire admissions program and all of the different factors that they consider, including legacies, and really rethink what is happening and how much they want to change it in order to really fulfill their missions, their pursuit of educational diversity in many of its forms. Legacy admissions does favor white applicants. That is the case currently. But some people, for example, many people that work in admissions in elite schools will say that it's now happening that legacy admissions, like the racial minorities, are doing quite well if they are legacies and applying. So even though overall it favors white applicants, legacy students who are racial minorities might be doing better in the pool in competing against white applicants who are also legacies, if you can imagine that. So it's not as simple as just getting rid of legacy admissions and that will overall help racial minorities. I think that it's a little bit more complicated. But I do think that in terms of the socioeconomic diversity that schools can pursue, looking really hard at legacy admissions and what it's doing for schools might be really just on the table now.
Deborah, do you want to respond to that? Can you be pro pushing more, better, creative diversity initiatives, but anti-affirmative action?
You certainly can, but I think some of that stems from a misunderstanding of what affirmative action is. Many people who view themselves as kind of pro-diversity and pro-increasing access, but say they are anti-affirmative action, have adopted this erroneous vision of affirmative action the court put forward today. An affirmative action program that is about set-asides and quotas. But that's been illegal for a very long time. Our colleges and universities are not using set-asides. They're not using quotas. And so I think when people say that they are pro-diversity but anti-affirmative action, they misunderstand how affirmative action and race-conscious admissions programs actually work.
Peter, we saw the impact that the end of Roe had at the ballot box in the midterms, especially among younger voters who weren't necessarily that enthused before we saw it overturned. Do you think this decision could have a similar impact in 2024 with liberals, with young people?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think polls on affirmative action are different than polls on abortion rights. There has not been this historically the same level of support for affirmative action across the board. Where it may be helpful is galvanizing Democratic-leaning voters who otherwise might not feel the need to come out and vote, right? In other words, if you're trying to rally your own troops to increase their turnout and that they may not feel they have a lot at stake in other ways, this is one way to appeal to them. And I think what more broadly speaking you'll hear from Democrats is that the overall direction of the court is at issue. They won't just talk about affirmative action. They'll talk about affirmative action in the context of Dobbs and abortion rights. They'll talk about in the context of other issues that the Supreme Court is considering, and they will make the argument that this court has become so extremist, so radical to the right, that you as a Democratic voter, as a liberal voter, have to turn out in order to, to balance that, to counter that by controlling the Congress and the White House. So it won't be in and of itself, it may or may not be that meaningful, but it's part of a broader argument. You can hear the advertisements already coming, I think.
Certainly can. Thank you all so much. Obviously, a super important topic, and you all helped us understand it a whole lot better.